Walk down to the Hamburg waterfront before sunrise, and you will hear the city before you see it. Gulls, cranes, the low horn of a container ship 400 meters long, sliding up the River Elbe toward one of the busiest harbors in Europe. Now consider a strange fact. Few cities on Earth have suffered so many different forms of destruction and remained so central to the world around them. Hamburg was burned by Vikings, strangled by Napoleon, gutted by its own great fire, poisoned by cholera, firebombed into ruins in a single week of 1943, and drowned by the North Sea. By any fair count, it is one of the unluckiest cities in Europe, and yet, again and again, through every disaster, it has returned to the role that came to define it. Germany's gateway to the world. This is the story of Hamburg, the fortress that became a merchant republic, the republic that became a doorway to America, the city that survived everything, and how. Chapter 1. The Fortress in the Marsh. Every great city begins with a reason, and Hamburg's reason was fear. Picture northern Germany in the year 800. There is no Germany yet. There is only the empire of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, pushing its border north and east after decades of brutal war against the Saxons. Beyond that border live the Danes to the north and the Slavic tribes to the east. And right at the point where these three worlds collide, two rivers meet. The small river Alster flows down from the north and empties into the mighty Elbe, which runs more than 1,000 kilometers from the mountains of Bohemia to the North Sea. The land here was not promising. It was marsh, bog, and flood plain, a soggy frontier where the ground itself could not be trusted. In the grey light of morning, the whole landscape would have looked like water pretending to be land. Reed beds and mud flats stretching toward the river, herons standing motionless in the shallows. But there was one patch of slightly higher ground near the bank, dry enough to build on, close enough to the water to control it. If you wanted to guard the empire's northern edge, this was where you built your wall. So someone built one, a wooden fortress with earthen walls. On that dry patch above the marsh, for a long time, historians dated it to around the year 808 and credited Charlemagne himself. Modern archaeologists who have dug beneath Hamburg's old cathedral square are more cautious. Their excavations suggest a fortified settlement may have existed there even earlier, and the exact details of who ordered it remain debated. What we know for certain is this. By the early 9th century, a Frankish fortress stood at the meeting of the Alster and the Elbe, and it carried a name, the Hammerburg. Even the name is a small mystery. Berg means fortress. That part is clear, but nobody is entirely sure what hammer meant. Some scholars think it described a bend in the river. Others think it meant the edge of a wooded ridge, or the marshland itself. The city of Hamburg, one of the great ports of the world, is named after a word whose meaning has been lost. There is something fitting about that. This was never a place that cared much about its own mythology. It was a place built to do a job, and the first job was not trade. It was conversion. In the 830s, the Frankish Empire sent a young monk named Ansgar to the Hammerburg. His mission was enormous. From this outpost, he was supposed to bring Christianity to the entire pagan north, to the Danes and the Swedes and every Viking chieftain in Scandinavia, Rome took the mission seriously enough that Hamburg, this wooden fort in a bog, was elevated to an archbishopric, one of the highest ranks in the medieval church. Ansgar built a church, a monastery, a library, and a school. For a brief moment, it looked like this frontier post might become the spiritual capital of Northern Europe. The Vikings had other plans. In the year 845, a Danish fleet came up the Elbe. Chroniclers of the era wrote of hundreds of ships, though medieval writers routinely inflated such numbers. So treat the figure with care. What is not in doubt is the result. The Danes stormed the Hammerberg, burned the church, burned the library, burned everything. Ansgar himself barely escaped with his life, reportedly fleeing without even his cloak. The great missionary center of the north had lasted roughly a decade. The archbishop's seat was moved south to the safer city of Bremen, beginning a rivalry between Hamburg and Bremen that, in friendlier forms, exists to this day. Now, here is the detail that tells you everything about the city Hamburg would become. After the fire of 845, the survivors came back. They rebuilt on the ashes, and then it happened again. Slavic armies destroyed the settlement in the year 983. It was rebuilt. Danish and Slavic forces struck again in the decades that followed. The chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing in the 1070s, described Hamburg's early history as an almost unbroken series of catastrophes, and by the traditional accounts drawn from his account and later chronicles, the settlement was destroyed and razed again close to a dozen times before it ever mattered to anyone but its neighbors. Think about what that means for the people living there. For an American viewer, the closest comparison might be a frontier town in hostile territory, rebuilt after every raid, except this frontier lasted 300 years. Generation after generation made the same choice. Not to leave, but to rebuild. A little stronger each time. A stone cathedral eventually rose where the wooden church had burned. Walls grew thicker, and slowly, the reason for staying began to change. Because while the soldiers and missionaries saw a border, the people who actually lived there saw something else. They saw the river. The Elbe was a highway into the heart of Central Europe, navigable for hundreds of kilometers upstream. Downstream, it opened to the North Sea, and from there to England, to Scandinavia, to the whole known world of northern trade. Salt, grain, timber, fish, force. Every valuable thing the North produced had to move by water, because medieval roads were little more than mud tracks. Whoever sat at the mouth of the Elbe sat at a toll booth on one of Europe's great trade routes. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Hamburg was becoming two settlements side by side, the old cathedral town of the archbishops, and next to it a newer traders' settlement, where merchants and ship owners were quietly accumulating something the medieval world rarely allowed common people to have: money, and with it, leverage. These merchants had a problem, though, in the feudal system, they were nobody. Every cargo they moved could be taxed by any duke, count, or bishop whose land touched the river. Every voyage down the Elbe meant paying toll after toll to armed men in castles. What the merchants of Hamburg wanted was something almost unheard of: freedom, free passage on their river, freedom from arbitrary taxes, the right to govern their own town. And at the end of the 12th century, they saw their chance. The local ruler, Count Adolf III of Schauenburg, needed money and settlers for his lands. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, was far away, preparing for a crusade from which he would never return. Somewhere in that gap between a needy count and a distant emperor, the merchants of Hamburg obtained a document, a charter dated to the year 1189, granting their city freedom from tolls on the lower Elbe all the way to the sea. That single piece of parchment would become the foundation of everything Hamburg was for the next 800 years. Its free port, its wealth, its stubborn independence, its very identity. There was just one problem with it, and that problem is where our story truly begins. Chapter 2: The Forged Charter that Built an Empire. In the harbour of Hamburg today, there is a date you will see everywhere. On flags, on beer labels, on the anniversary of the port itself, celebrated every May with fireworks and tall ships. The date is May the 7th, 1189, the day Emperor Frederick Barbarossa supposedly granted Hamburg free passage on the Elbe, free from tolls, all the way to the sea. Here is the uncomfortable truth that Hamburg's own historians will tell you. Barbarossa almost certainly never signed the document the city treasured. The parchment that Hamburg guarded for centuries, the founding charter of its freedom, is widely regarded by scholars as a later fabrication. Researchers who examined it found that its script, its seal, and its legal formulas do not match genuine imperial documents of the 1180s. The consensus among historians is that the surviving charter was probably produced, or at least first presented, in the mid-13th century, most likely in the 1260s. Roughly 80 years after the date written on it. Who exactly ordered it made, and how much they saw themselves as forgers rather than as restorers of a lost right, we cannot know. What we can say is that the city presented it as imperial law and defended it as law for the next 600 years. And before we judge too harshly, it helps to understand what was probably going on. Many historians believe the fabrication was not invented out of thin air. Count Adolf III, the local ruler, seems to have made real promises to the new town around 1189, possibly reflecting concessions the emperor had approved in person or in a document that was lost. Hamburg had raised money for the crusade Barbarossa was preparing. Some kind of deal was struck, but a promise from a local count was fragile, and Barbarossa drowned on that crusade in 1190, far away in Anatolia. A promise from a dead emperor, written down by no one, was worth nothing. So somewhere in the following decades, in effect, the city gave its memory a physical form. It produced the document it believed history owed it. Whatever we think of the ethics, the strategy worked almost unbelievably well. Later emperors and courts accepted the charter, the toll freedom held, and in a world where every river was a chain of tax collectors, a city with legal free passage to the sea had an advantage that compounded year after year, like interest on a fortune. If you are watching this in America, think of it this way. Hamburg's founding document is a little like a startup faking its first big contract, then growing so successful that the fake becomes true. The story is not flattering, but it tells you exactly what kind of city this was. Hamburg did not worship kings or saints. It worshipped leverage. And in these same decades, Hamburg was transforming physically. Count Adolf founded a new merchant town beside the old cathedral town, with its own harbour on the Ulster and its own church. St. Nicholas, the sailors' church. For a while the two Hamburgs existed side by side. Priests on one bank of the divide, traders on the other. And you can guess which side was growing faster. The Danes swept in and occupied the city in the early 1200s. Because Denmark at that time was the superpower of the Baltic. But Danish power collapsed after a decisive defeat at the Battle of Bornhoeved in 1227, and Hamburg came out of the wreckage more united than before. The old town and the new town merged into a single city with a single council. By the mid-1200s, Hamburg was effectively running its own affairs. A republic of merchants in everything but name. There was just one thing missing, a partner, because Hamburg had a geographic problem. Its river, the Elbe, flows into the North Sea, facing west toward England and Flanders, but the richest trade of the age was happening on the other side of the Danish peninsula, in the Baltic Sea, where a young boom town called Lübeck was gathering the wealth of the entire East. Furs from Russia, wax for church candles, grain from the vast plains, herring from the richest fishing grounds in Europe. Between the two seas lay Denmark, and sailing around it meant a long, dangerous voyage through waters controlled by Danish kings and infested with pirates. But look at a map, and you will see what the merchants saw. Between Hamburg on the North Sea side and Lübeck on the Baltic side, the neck of land is barely 60 kilometers wide. Goods could travel overland between the two cities in a couple of days, protected the whole way. Baltic goods could flow into Lübeck, cross to Hamburg, and sail out the Elbe to the west. Western goods, above all cloth and salt, could flow the other way. Two cities, two seas, one corridor. In 1241, Hamburg and Lübeck made it official. Their representatives agreed to share the costs of protecting the road between them and to jointly fight the pirates and robber barons who preyed on their trade. It was a modest, practical document about road security. Nobody involved thought they were founding anything historic. They were wrong. That working agreement between two trading cities is often cited as a seed of what would grow into the most powerful commercial alliance of the medieval world. It would come to be called the Hansa, the Hanseatic League, and for the next 3 centuries, it would make a handful of northern merchant cities richer and more feared than most kingdoms in Europe. Chapter 3. Europe's first corporate superpower. To understand what the Hanseatic League was, it helps to start with what it was not. It was not a country. It had no king, no capital, no standing army, no constitution, and for a long time not even a membership list. If you had asked a medieval merchant to show you the Hansa, he could not point to anything, and yet this loose, almost invisible network came to dominate the trade of northern Europe from London to Russia, dictate terms to kings, and win a war against a nation. The closest modern comparison, and it is one American, viewers will feel instantly, is a cross between a trade bloc and a cartel of corporations. Imagine the biggest shipping and logistics companies of today forming a private club, setting common rules, sharing warehouses in every major port, boycotting any country that mistreated a member, and occasionally hiring a fleet to enforce the point. That, roughly, was the Hansa. It was not a corporation in any modern legal sense, but it behaved like one in spirit. At its height, it connected close to 200 towns, with a core of perhaps 70, and Hamburg and Lübeck sat at the center of the web. The system ran on a chain of foreign outposts called contours, and the names alone sketch the map of the medieval economy. A walled compound on the Thames in London called the Steel Yard, with its own warehouses, its own chapel, and tax privileges English merchants bitterly resented. A trading house in Bruges. At the crossroads to Italy and the Mediterranean, a wharf in Bergen in Norway that controlled the export of dried cod, and far to the east in Novgorod in Russia, a fortified yard where the furs that warmed wealthy Europe were bought by the thousand. Between these outposts moved the workhorse of the League, a fat-bellied, high-sided ship called the Cog, not fast and not beautiful, but able to carry more cargo with a smaller crew than anything the North had sailed before. Every member city had its specialty, and Hamburg's was one that may surprise you: beer. Beer was a staple of daily life in medieval northern Europe, part of an ordinary household's diet, valued for its calories, its taste, and above all its keeping qualities. And Hamburg turned brewing into an export industry on a scale nobody had seen before. The city's brewers adopted hops as a preservative earlier than most of their rivals, which meant Hamburg beer could survive a long sea voyage without spoiling. That single technical edge opened the entire overseas market. By the late 14th century, brewing was Hamburg's biggest industry, with hundreds of breweries operating inside the walls. And contemporaries took to calling Hamburg the brew house of the Hansa, the city that would one day pump oil and coffee and containers through its harbour first got rich shipping beer to Scandinavia and the Netherlands. But the Hansa's real power was never just commercial. It was the power to say no. If a king taxed Hanseatic merchants too hard, or seized their goods, or failed to punish pirates in his waters, the League did not send a protest letter. It sent nothing at all. No ships, no salt, no grain, no cloth, a coordinated boycott, city after city refusing to trade, until the offending ruler felt his ports go quiet and his prices go wild. Kings of England, princes of Russia, counts of Flanders, all of them at various times bent under this pressure. Salt and herring turned out to be stronger arguments than swords. And when boycotts were not enough, the merchants fought. In the 1360s, King Valdemar IV of Denmark decided to break the League's power, seizing the island of Gotland and its wealthy Hanseatic town of Visby. The cities answered by doing something almost unthinkable for a club of businessmen. They raised a war fleet, taxed themselves to pay for it, and went to war with the Kingdom of Denmark. The first campaign went badly. The second did not. Hanseatic ships attacked Copenhagen itself, and in 1370 Denmark accepted the Peace of Stralsund, a treaty so lopsided it still astonishes historians. The League won confirmation of its trading privileges across Denmark, control of key fortresses on the strategic strait between the seas for 15 years, and, by many accounts, even a formal say in approving the next Danish king. Stop and sit with that for a moment. A network of merchant towns, with no country and no crown, had defeated a kingdom in war and claimed a voice in choosing its monarch. Few commercial alliances in European history, before or since, have ever imposed terms on a kingdom so completely. It was as if a chamber of commerce had won a veto over a throne. For Hamburg, the golden decades that followed brought a self-confidence you can still feel in the city today. The Council of Merchants answered to no duke and no bishop. The city expanded its walls, dug canals so that ships could unload directly at warehouse doors, and began calling itself free in official documents. Hamburg's neighbors had cathedrals and castles. Hamburg had contracts, credit, and a harbor full of cogs. But there is a flaw built into every cartel, and the Hansa carried its own death inside it from the beginning. Its power depended on controlling the routes between east and west, the moment trade found other paths, or other players grew strong enough to ignore the boycotts. The whole invisible empire would begin to dissolve. By the end of the 14th century, the first cracks were already showing. Dutch ships were appearing in the Baltic in growing numbers. English merchants were pushing back against the Steelyard. And, in the North Sea, pirates, calling themselves the Victual Brothers, were about to give Hamburg both its greatest security crisis and its most famous legend. That legend has a name and a severed head, and it walks into our story next. Chapter 4. Pirates, Herring, and a Dying League. In the year 1401, on a muddy island in the Elbe called the Grasbrook, just outside Hamburg's walls, an executioner raised his sword over the most famous pirate in German history. His name was Klaus Störtebeker, and what supposedly happened next has been told in Hamburg taverns for 600 years. The legend goes like this. Störtebeker made a deal with the city council. After his beheading, his headless body would walk down the line of his captured crewmen, and every man he passed would go free. The sword fell, the body rose, and it staggered past 10. 11. 12 of his companions before a guard threw a wooden club under its feet and ended the miracle. And then, the story says, the council broke its word and executed the freed men anyway. Let us be clear about this story. There is no reliable evidence that any of it happened. Even Störtebeker's real name and origins are uncertain, and some researchers question the traditional details of the execution itself. What the records do support is simpler and darker. Around the turn of the 15th century, Hamburg fought a naval campaign against a pirate brotherhood, captured its leaders, and beheaded them by the dozen on the Grasbrook, displaying the heads on stakes along the riverbank as a warning to anyone sailing in. The pirates were called the Victual Brothers, and they were not romantic outlaws. They had begun as hired privateers in a Baltic war, supplying a besieged Stockholm, which is where their strange name comes from. When the war ended, they kept the ships and kept the habit, plundering merchant traffic and even sacking whole ports. For a trading city, this was not an annoyance. It was an existential threat. Hamburg's entire existence rested on one promise: that goods leaving its harbour would arrive somewhere else. So Hamburg calculated, armed itself, and removed the problem. The message on those stakes was addressed to the whole North Sea. This city protects its cargo. It is a strong image. The merchant republic at the height of its confidence, which makes what happened over the next 200 years so strange. Because the league that Hamburg belonged to, the mighty Hansa that had humbled kings, was about to die, slowly, quietly, without a single decisive battle, and Hamburg would survive it by committing what you might call a very profitable act of betrayal. The first blow came from a fish. Herring was the protein of medieval Europe, eaten on every fast day the church calendar required, and the Hansa had grown fat on the Baltic herring trade. But over the 15th and 16th centuries, that advantage eroded. The Baltic herring economy that had enriched the League weakened, while Dutch fishermen expanded aggressively in the North Sea, using a new technique of gutting and barreling the catch right on board that let them stay out for weeks and deliver a better, cheaper product. The Dutch then sailed their efficient ships straight into the Baltic and undercut Hanseatic freight rates in the League's own home waters. The cartel's old weapons, boycotts and privileges, worked poorly against a rival who was faster, cheaper, and backed by a rising state. The second blow came from the map itself. In the decades around 1500, Portuguese ships reached India, and Spanish ships reached the Americas. The center of gravity of world trade began a long swing away from the Baltic and toward the Atlantic. Cities facing the ocean, Lisbon, Antwerp, Amsterdam, London, started their climb. The inner Baltic slowly became a side room of the world economy. Now look at where Hamburg sits. Not on the Baltic, on the North Sea, facing the Atlantic world. The disaster that was starving Lübeck and the eastern cities was, for Hamburg, an open door, and Hamburg walked through it with very few sentimental regrets. When England's merchant adventurers, the cloth exporters who were the sworn enemies of the Hansa's London privileges, needed a friendly continental port, Hamburg invited them in. In 1567, over the League's furious objections, when Antwerp, the financial capital of Europe, was sacked and blockaded in the Dutch wars of religion, its refugees, Protestant merchants, and Portuguese Jewish traders with connections across the new Atlantic world, needed a home. Hamburg took them, along with their capital, their networks, and their knowledge of sugar, spices, and exchange banking. The city that had been built on Baltic beer quietly rebuilt itself on Atlantic trade. The old League lingered on paper. Its last General Assembly met in 1669, with only a handful of cities bothering to attend. There was no dramatic ending, no fall of a capital, because there was no capital to fall. The Hansa simply stopped being useful, and so it stopped being. 3 cities kept the name alive: Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, styling themselves Hanseatic cities to this day. Look at a German license plate from Hamburg and you will see the letters HH, Hansestadt Hamburg, a membership card for a club that dissolved 3.5 centuries ago. Inside the walls. Meanwhile, Hamburg was changing its soul as well as its business model. The Reformation arrived, and in 1529 the city formally went Lutheran, reorganizing its churches, schools, and welfare under a new civic order. Compared with the religious upheavals that tore through many other cities, Hamburg's Reformation was carried through largely by ordinances, negotiation, and institutional reform rather than sustained bloodshed. And in 1558, the merchants founded a stock exchange, one of the oldest in the German-speaking world, a place where grain, insurance, and eventually shares changed hands under the open sky before a building was ever raised. By the year 1600, the pattern of the next chapters was set. The League was gone. The neighbors were poor. And Hamburg, the pragmatic survivor, stood alone at the mouth of its river, rich, armed, and watching the horizon, which was wise, because the most destructive war in German history was 10 years away. Chapter 5. The Neutral City in an Age of Wars. Between 1618 and 1648, Germany tore itself apart. The 30 Years' War began as a religious conflict and decayed into 3 decades of marching armies, burned villages, famine, and plague. Historians estimate that the German lands suffered demographic losses running into the millions through violence, disease, hunger, displacement, and collapsing birth rates. And in some regions the population fell by 1/3 or more. Entire cities were wiped from the map. Magdeburg, upstream on the very same river Elbe, was stormed in 1631 and destroyed so completely that its name became a byword for annihilation. Hamburg's story in those 30 years can be told in one sentence. Nothing happened to it. No Sieg, no sack, no occupation. While Germany bled, Hamburg's population grew. Its trade expanded, and its bankers did business with every side. This was not luck. It was the payoff of 2 very deliberate investments, made just in time. The first investment was walls. In the years around 1616 to 1625, Hamburg hired a Dutch engineer, Johann van Valkenburg, to wrap the entire city in a new ring of fortifications built to the most modern standard of the age. Massive earthen ramparts, angled bastions designed to survive cannon fire, wide water-filled moats. It was brutally expensive, and the city taxed itself to pay for it. But for the rest of the war, every general who looked at Hamburg made the same calculation. This city would cost a long, ruinous siege to take. Easier to leave it alone and borrow its money instead. The ramparts were never taken by direct assault in their entire existence, and you can trace their line today in the green belt of parks that curves around the old city. Hamburg's defenses worked so well they eventually became a garden. The second investment was financial. In 1619, the city founded the Bank of Hamburg, an exchange bank modelled on Amsterdam's, which gave merchants a stable unit of account in a Germany drowning in debased wartime coinage. While princes clipped their currency to pay their armies, a merchant's balance in Hamburg held its value. In the middle of chaos, Hamburg sold the one commodity that becomes priceless in wartime: reliability. And so the pattern was set that would define the city for 2 centuries. Stay neutral. Stay armed. Trade with everyone. The wars came constantly. Sweden against Denmark. England against Holland. France against everybody. And Hamburg declared itself a spectator and sent out its merchant fleet. It was dangerous work. Barbary corsairs raided northern shipping and sold captured sailors into slavery. So, from the 1660s, Hamburg built armed convoy frigates to escort its merchantmen past the danger zones. There were epidemics, too, including a devastating plague in 1713 and 1714 that killed roughly 10,000 people. But decade by decade, the strategy compounded, and the city grew into one of the largest in the German lands. Its golden age arrived, ironically, courtesy of other people's revolutions. When the American colonies broke from Britain, direct trade opened between Hamburg and American ports, and tobacco, rice, and later cotton began flowing up the Elbe. When revolutionary France went to war with Britain in the 1790s and Amsterdam fell under French control, neutral Hamburg suddenly inherited a huge share of Europe's Atlantic trade, almost overnight. Fortunes were made in a season, and contemporary observers described the 1790s as the richest decade the city had ever seen. Pause on that image for a moment. A continent on fire from Lisbon to Moscow, and in the middle of it, one city where the warehouses were full, the coffee houses were crowded, and the biggest problem was finding enough ships. Hamburg had perfected its formula. Other people's wars were Hamburg's business opportunities. Then, in the autumn of 1806, the formula met Napoleon Bonaparte, and it stopped working. French troops marched into Hamburg without a fight, because against the army that had just crushed Prussia, those beautiful ramparts were a museum piece, and Napoleon did to Hamburg the one thing the city could not survive. He closed the sea. His continental system banned all trade with Britain, which for Hamburg meant banning the harbour's reason to exist. Witnesses said grass grew on the wharves. Smuggling exploded, and the French answered with customs agents, censors, and firing squads. In 1810, Napoleon annexed the city outright, making the proud Free Republic a provincial capital of the French Empire. Then he took its money too, seizing the silver of the Bank of Hamburg. The worst came at the end. In 1813, as Napoleon's empire cracked after the Russian disaster, Hamburg rose against the French, and Russian raiding troops briefly entered the city. Napoleon sent back one of his hardest marshals, Louis-Nicolas Davout, with orders to hold Hamburg at any cost. Davout fortified the city, and in the terrible winter of 1813 to 1814, he expelled thousands of residents who could not prove they had food for a siege. By many estimates, 20,000 people or more, driving them out of the gates into the snow. Accounts from the time describe over 1,000 of them dying of cold and disease in the weeks that followed. The occupation outlasted the empire itself. Davout, cut off from news and refusing to believe Napoleon had fallen, held Hamburg until May of 1814 and marched out undefeated. The city the French left behind was traumatized, plundered, and bankrupt, its population sharply reduced, its bank looted, its trade in ruins. An entire generation of wealth was gone. And yet, if you have followed this story from the beginning, you already know what happened next. Because it is the only thing this city ever does. The merchants counted their losses, reopened the exchange, and sent the ships out again. What nobody could have guessed was where the next fortune would come from. Not from spices, not from beer, not from other people's wars. It would come from people, millions of them, walking to the docks with everything they owned in a single trunk, asking for passage to a place called America. But before that story, Hamburg had one more appointment with catastrophe. This time, the enemy was not an army. It started on a spring night in a street called the Deichstrasse, and by the third morning, a third of the city was gone. Chapter 6. The Great Fire. It began, as far as anyone could ever determine, in the early hours of May the 5th, 1842, in a building on the Deichstrasse, one of the oldest streets in Hamburg, where timbered warehouses and homes had stood packed together since the Middle Ages. A fire broke out in a property connected to the tobacco trade, a cigar workshop by most accounts, though the exact cause was never established. Fires happened in old cities all the time. The night watchman sounded the alarm. The pumps rolled out, and nobody in Hamburg went to bed that night expecting to lose their city. But everything was wrong that week. The spring had been unusually dry. The water level in the canals was low. A stiff wind was blowing, and the old city was, in the most literal sense, fuel. Centuries of wooden buildings, attics stuffed with trade goods, warehouses full of oil, spirits, and rubber, all of it stacked along alleys so narrow that neighbors could shake hands across them from their upper windows. The fire jumped the Deichstrasse. Then it jumped the canal. By the end of the first day, it was no longer a fire in the city. It was the city. For 3 days and 3 nights, Hamburg burned. The flames took the old town hall, so the Senate ordered it blown up with gunpowder to create a firebreak. And the explosion failed to stop anything. The fire took the church of St. Nicholas, whose tower collapsed in flames. It took St. Peter's, one of the oldest churches in the city. It took the banks, the archives, whole streets of merchant houses that had survived Napoleon, the plague, and 200 years of wars. Witnesses described a glow visible from far outside the city and burning debris carried on the wind. People dragged furniture to the shore of the Ulster Lake and stood among their rescued chairs and mirrors, watching their entire world burn behind them. When the fire finally died on May the 8th, the accounting was brutal. Around 51 people had been killed, a mercifully low number for a disaster of this scale. But roughly a third of the inner city was gone. Contemporary tallies counted over 1,700 houses destroyed, along with churches, public buildings, and warehouses, and about 20,000 people, a sixth of the city's population, were homeless. Hamburg's medieval heart, the physical record of the Hansa itself, had been erased in 72 hours. And now comes the moment that separates Hamburg from almost every other city in this story so far. Because the response to the fire was not grief, it was a committee. Within weeks, while the ruins were still warm, the Senate established a technical commission to redesign the burned district. And the commission made a decision that would horrify a modern preservationist. Hamburg would not rebuild what it had lost. No reconstruction of the crooked medieval lanes, no nostalgic restoration. The fire was treated, with remarkable cold blood. As an opportunity, the new plan drew wide. Straight streets where alleys had been. It created new canals and quaysides built for commerce. Architects like Alexis de Chateauneuf gave the city a new civic elegance, including the arcades along the Alster that are still one of Hamburg's most beautiful spaces. A city of stone and brick rose where a city of wood had stood, and below the streets, something even more important happened. Hamburg hired a British engineer, William Lindley, to build a modern water and sewer system, among the first of its kind on the European continent. Remember that name, Lindley, and remember that sewer system, because half a century later, the question of whether Hamburg had finished the job Lindley started would become a matter of life and death for thousands of people. The city even turned its scars into monuments. The ruined Church of St. Nicholas was rebuilt over the following decades to a design by the English architect George Gilbert Scott, and its new spire, completed in the 1870s, briefly stood as the tallest structure in the world. Hold that image for a moment. A church tower, born from Hamburg's greatest fire, reaching higher than anything humans had ever built. In roughly a century, that same tower would preside over a far greater fire, and it stands today, once again, a ruin, as the city's central war memorial. Hamburg's two great burnings are connected by a single building. The reconstruction was paid for the Hamburg way, with loans, insurance, and a special tax. And the city roared back faster than anyone expected, because the timing, once again, was almost supernaturally lucky. The 1840s were the dawn of the railway age in Germany. New tracks soon linked Hamburg toward Berlin and the interior, meaning the harbour now had an iron river flowing inland alongside the Elbe. Steamships were beginning to cross the Atlantic on schedules, not on the whim of the wind. World trade was about to explode, and Hamburg, rebuilt, modernized, and hungry, was positioned exactly at the door. All it needed now was a cargo, and history was preparing one, the strangest and most human cargo the port would ever handle. Chapter 7. Gateway to America. If your family came to America from Germany, from Poland, from Russia, from Hungary, from anywhere in Central or Eastern Europe, stop for a moment and ask yourself a question. How exactly did they get there? Not why. How? Which road? Which border? Which ship? For millions of American families, the honest answer runs through one place, a stretch of waterfront in Hamburg, Between roughly 1850 and the 1930s, historians estimate that around 5 million emigrants left Europe through the port of Hamburg. The great majority of them bound for the United States. 5 million people. That is more than the population of Los Angeles today. Walking up gangways on the Elbe with their lives packed into trunks and pillowcases. If you are an American of European descent, the odds are real that someone in your family tree once stood on a Hamburg quay, holding a ticket, looking at a ship, and deciding to become someone new. To make that number human, picture a single figure standing in for the millions. The kind of traveler the records describe, passing through here by the thousand, a young woman from somewhere in the Russian Empire, who has never seen the sea. She has been traveling for weeks, by cart and by train, across borders whose languages she does not speak. The price of her ticket is her family's savings, guarded on her body the whole way. And in her head is an address in New York belonging to a relative she has never met. Everything about her old life ends at the water's edge. Multiply her by 5 million, and you have some idea of what this harbour actually was. The flood began with Germans themselves, fleeing failed harvests, poverty, and the political defeats of the 1840s, but from the 1880s onward, the composition changed. Pogroms and brutal anti-Jewish laws in the Russian Empire set entire communities in motion, and a growing share of the people moving through Hamburg were Jewish families from the east, traveling in stages across Europe toward the sea. They arrived by train in a city whose language most of them did not speak, carrying everything they owned, easy prey for every swindler, fake ticket agent, and price-gouging landlord in northern Germany. Contemporary reports describe emigrants cheated out of their savings before they ever saw the ocean. The business of moving these people was chaotic, exploitative, and enormously profitable, and it was about to be reorganized by one of the most remarkable businessmen of the age, a man almost unknown in America, despite the fact that he probably touched more American family histories than any industrialist of his era. His name was Albert Ballin. Ballin was born in Hamburg in 1857. The youngest son of a struggling Jewish emigration agent. That detail matters. In the society of Imperial Germany, where Jews were barred by prejudice from the officer corps, the high bureaucracy, and most of polite society, the shipping business was one of the few ladders open to talent. Ballin started at the bottom of it, in his father's small agency, booking passengers onto other people's ships. He turned out to be a genius at it. His business strategy, visible in everything he built, treated the emigrant not as human freight to be packed per square meter, but as a mass-market customer who would compare prices, remember treatment, and write letters home recommending a line. There were millions of such customers, and the company that served them decently stood to win them all. By 1886, the giant Hamburg America line, known as Hapag, had hired the young Ballin to run its passenger business. By 1899, he was effectively running the entire company. Under his leadership, Hapag grew into what was widely described as the largest shipping company in the world, with a fleet that dwarfed rivals and a route network that circled the planet. The company motto was Mein Feld ist die Welt. My field is the world. For a boy from a poor Jewish family in the Hamburg emigrant trade, It was not just a slogan. It was a biography. And Berlin rebuilt the emigrant experience end to end. In the early 1900s, Hamburg opened a purpose-built emigrant city on the Wedel Island in the harbour, a complex of clean dormitories, kitchens serving kosher food, a synagogue and churches, doctors, and quarantine station, where travellers waited for their ships in safety instead of in the hands of slumlords. People called it the Emigrant Halls, and today its reconstruction is a museum known as Berlinstadt, Berlin's city. Make no mistake. This was business, not charity. American immigration law fined shipping companies for every passenger rejected at the port of arrival. So healthy, documented, well-processed emigrants was simply better cargo. But it is one of history's better bargains. Profit and humanity, for once, pointed the same direction. Stand at Berlinstadt today and think about what moved through those halls. A family from a shtetl near Kiev, a farm boy from Pomerania, a seamstress from Galicia. Weeks later, they were filing through the inspection lines at Ellis Island, and in the years that followed, many of their names were shortened, translated, or respelled, sometimes by employers, sometimes by schools, most often by the families themselves, sanding an old world name down into an American one. Hamburg was the hinge of that transformation, the last European ground under millions of feet. The city grew rich on the passage, and on everything that sailed with it. Shipyards boomed, and one of them, Blohm and Voss, founded in 1877 on the harbour's south bank, grew into one of the great shipbuilders of the world. By 1913, Berlin's company was launching ocean liners on a scale never attempted before. Floating cities with names like Imperator and Vaterland, among the largest ships ever built at the time, carrying everyone from millionaires in gilded suites to emigrants in steerage across the Atlantic in a week. Hamburg in these decades joined the new German Empire, proclaimed in 1871, but did so on very Hamburg terms, negotiating to keep its harbour a free port outside the customs union until 1888. As part of that bargain, the city built something extraordinary, the Speicherstadt, a district of massive brick warehouses rising straight out of the canals. Still today, one of the largest connected warehouse complexes on Earth, and now a World Heritage Site. Walk its canals in the evening, and you can smell what the 19th century smelled like there. Coffee, tea, spices, and river water, drifting between walls of dark red brick. The harbour handled more tonnage every year. The city's population passed 500,000 and kept climbing. It was, by every visible measure, a golden age. But golden ages have basements. And in Hamburg's basement, something was quietly rotting. The merchant senate that ran the city had modernized its streets, its docks, and its warehouses, but not its priorities. Tens of thousands of harbour workers were crammed into damp alley quarters at shocking densities. And the city's drinking water, the water in every kettle and every child's cup, still came straight from the Elbe, drawn through intake pipes and settling basins, but passed through no filter of any kind. Engineers had been warning for years that this was gambling with catastrophe. The Senate found the cost of a filtration plant easier to postpone than to pay. In the summer of 1892, cholera was raging in parts of the Russian Empire, and like every epidemic of the age, it travelled outward along the railways and rivers of a connected world. By August, the disease had reached Hamburg. How exactly it arrived, no one can say with certainty, but what happened when it arrived was not decided by any traveller. It was decided by the water pipes. Because a single case of cholera in a city with filtered water is an incident. A single case in a city pumping raw river water into 100,000 kitchens is the opening of a catastrophe. The city that had survived Vikings, Napoleon, and its own great fire was about to be brought to its knees by the one enemy it had built for itself. Chapter 8. Cholera, Shame, and Reform. In the middle of August, 1892, doctors in Hamburg's harbour districts began seeing patients with a frightening set of symptoms: violent cramps, uncontrollable diarrhea, a thirst that nothing could satisfy, and a strange bluish grey tint spreading across the skin as the body drained itself of water. Any physician of that era knew the signature on sight: cholera. What happened next is one of the most damning stories in the history of any modern city, because the disaster that followed was not a mystery and not an accident. It was the bill for a decision, made and remade for years, by men who had been warned. Start with what Hamburg knew. Cholera had visited Europe repeatedly through the 19th century, and by 1892 the science had fundamentally changed. The German bacteriologist Robert Koch had identified the cholera bacterium a decade earlier, and the evidence was mounting that the disease travelled above all through contaminated drinking water. A famous investigation in London in the 1850s had already tied an outbreak to a single water pump. The lesson for any city drinking from a river was written in capital letters: filter your water. Hamburg drank straight from the Elbe. The intake pipes sat where the tides could push the harbour's own sewage back across them. William Lindley's engineers and their successors had given the city sewers and running water decades earlier. But the crucial final step, a filtration plant, kept being postponed. It was expensive. Property owners grumbled about taxes. The Senate of Merchants, brilliant at counting the cost of everything, decided year after year that clean water could wait one more budget. And right next door, this detail matters, stood the separate Prussian-run city of Altona, directly downstream, which had already built a slow sand filtration system for its own supply. Same river, same water, one filter between them. So when the bacterium reached Hamburg in that hot, dry August, arriving through the ordinary movement of people and goods in a connected world, the outcome was not decided by whoever carried it. It was decided by the pipes. The summer heat had warmed the low river. The port was crowded, and the pumps did what they did every day. They distributed the Elbe, and everything in it, into 100,000 kitchens. The explosion was immediate and monstrous. Within days, hundreds were falling ill every 24 hours. Hospitals overflowed into sheds and tents. Disinfection columns moved through the alley quarters, spraying carbolic acid. Corpses were collected by the wagon load, and witnesses described coffins stacked at the cemeteries faster than graves could be dug. Families in the packed courtyards of the harbour districts sometimes lost several members in a single week. The city's trade, its lifeblood, stopped dead as ports around the world quarantined anything arriving from Hamburg. In roughly 6 terrible weeks, the epidemic infected close to 17,000 people and killed. By the most commonly cited counts, about 8,600. And then came the comparison that turned tragedy into scandal. Altona, sharing the same riverbank, the same weather, and much of the same poverty, suffered only a small fraction of Hamburg's losses. Investigators at the time were astonished to find streets along the boundary where the houses drew water from different systems, and the illness followed the water lines, not the street lines. Nature had run a controlled experiment on a living city, and the result convicted Hamburg's government. Robert Koch himself, one of the most celebrated scientists in Germany, came to Hamburg to lead the imperial response, touring the reeking alley quarters where the epidemic burned hottest. He was later widely quoted as saying that he forgot he was in Europe, however he meant it. The remark landed like a slap. For a city that saw itself as a peer of London and New York, it was humiliating. The shame did what the warnings had not. The filtration plant that had been debated for decades was rushed to completion within months. The city created a modern public health apparatus, tore into the worst of the alley quarters in the years that followed, and rebuilt its port hygiene so thoroughly that it became a model studied abroad. The epidemic broke something politically too. The old rule of the merchant families, which had survived Napoleon and fire, never fully recovered its authority. Working-class Hamburg, which had buried most of the dead, began organizing, voting, and demanding power. And over the following generation, the city became one of the strongholds of German social democracy. When people ask why Hamburg's politics lean the way they do even today, part of the answer is buried in the cholera cemeteries of 1892. Here is the editorial point, and it is the reason this chapter belongs in the story. Every disaster in this series so far came from outside the walls. Vikings, marshals, sparks, and storms. This one was manufactured at home, by the governing logic of the city itself. A republic optimized for commerce had discovered the one thing markets cannot price until it is too late. And thousands of its poorest citizens had paid the bill. Hamburg learned the lesson brutally and, to its credit, permanently. But hold on to the shape of this story. A government calculating that the unthinkable can be postponed one more year. Shapes like that have a way of returning, because the harbour kept growing. The liners kept sailing, and the empire whose flag they flew was steering, with its eyes wide open, toward the abyss. Chapter 9. War, Hunger, and the Swastika. On the 1st of August, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, and within a week, nearly every great power in Europe was mobilizing. Across Germany, newspapers described cheering crowds. In Hamburg, the mood among the men who actually ran the city was very different, and no one embodied it better than Albert Ballin. the master of the world's largest shipping line, understood instantly what most of the empire did not. For a global trading city, war with Britain was not an opportunity or even a risk. It was a death sentence with a delay. He was right, with terrible speed. The British Navy sealed the North Sea and Hamburg's harbour, one of the busiest on the European continent, simply stopped. Hundreds of ships were interned in foreign harbours or trapped at their berths. The cranes froze. Hapag's magnificent liners sat idle in the Elbe, and their crews were sent to the trenches. Shipyards like Blohm and Voss converted to war work and began building a new kind of vessel that would define Germany's war at sea: the submarine. Then came the part of World War I that American audiences rarely hear about, because it happened not on battlefields, but in kitchens. The British blockade cut Germany off not just from trade, but from food and fertilizer. And Germany's own mismanagement made the shortage worse. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, remembered in Germany as the turnip winter, the potato harvest had failed and city dwellers were living on Swedes. Ersatzbread and Kuh. Port cities with no farmland of their own stood at the end of every supply chain. Rations in the industrial districts fell far below what a working body needs. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of German civilians died during the war from causes linked to malnutrition and its diseases, and Hamburg buried its share of them. Disproportionately, the old, the poor, and the young. 4 years of that, and the ending arrived not from the front, but from the water's edge. In late October 1918, with the war visibly lost, the German Admiralty ordered its fleet to sail out for a final, honor-saving battle against the British. The sailors, who could count, refused. The mutiny began in the fleet anchorages and spread within days to the port cities. In early November, sailors, dock workers, and soldiers took control of Hamburg. Red flags went up over the harbour, and workers' councils declared themselves the new authority. The empire dissolved from the coast inward. The Kaiser abdicated, and a republic was proclaimed in Berlin. Albert Ballin did not live to see even that. On the 9th of November, 1918, as the empire he had served collapsed, Ballin died after taking an overdose of sleeping medication. Whether it was deliberate suicide or a desperate accident has been debated ever since. But those close to him described a man whose world had been annihilated. His life's work, the greatest merchant fleet on earth, was handed over to the victors as reparations. Ship by ship, the Imperator, his pride, ended up sailing under a British flag. It is one of the bitterest personal stories in Hamburg's history. The emigrant agent's son, who built a bridge across the Atlantic and lived just long enough to watch it demolished. The 1920s in Hamburg were a fever chart. At the bottom, catastrophe after catastrophe. Hyperinflation in 1923 burned through savings until a loaf of bread cost billions of marks, and dock workers were paid twice a day so they could spend the money before evening. That same autumn, a young communist named Ernst Thälmann led an armed uprising in the harbour district of Barmbek, storming police stations in a doomed attempt to spark a German revolution. It was crushed within days, leaving dozens dead. And yet between the crises the old Hamburg machine kept restarting. Hapag rebuilt a fleet. Trade with America resumed. And by the late 20s, the harbour was again among the busiest in the world. The city even elected, year after year, sober social democratic governments that built public housing, schools, and parks that are still in use today. Then, in October 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the flood of American credit that had been keeping the German economy afloat reversed overnight. World trade contracted savagely, and no German city was more exposed to world trade than Hamburg. By the early 30s, unemployment in the city had reached catastrophic levels, with roughly 1 in 3 workers idle and the docks half dead. Hunger returned. Street violence between communists and Nazis became a weekly rhythm. In July 1932, in the neighboring Prussian city of Altona, a Nazi march routed provocatively through a working class, heavily communist quarter, and the day ended in bloodshed, with most of the 18 dead killed by police gunfire during the chaos. It is remembered as Altona's Bloody Sunday, and it captured in a single afternoon how close the streets of northern Germany already were to open war. Here is what an honest accounting has to say next, because it complicates the story Hamburg sometimes tells about itself. This liberal, international, social democratic port city was genuinely more resistant to Nazism at the ballot box than most of Germany, but only relatively. In the free elections of the early 30s, the Nazi Party polled somewhat worse in Hamburg than in the country as a whole. Yet it still became the strongest party in the city. Tens of thousands of Hamburg's own citizens, ruined, frightened, or resentful, voted for Adolf Hitler. What followed Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933 was not a surrender, and it deserves to be described precisely within weeks, under emergency decrees that suspended basic rights, backed by mass arrests and the open violence of Nazi paramilitaries in the streets. Hamburg's elected institutions were dismantled from above. Opposition politicians were jailed or driven out. The Senate was purged and replaced. And a Reich governor was installed over the proud free city. The process had a bureaucratic name, Gleichschaltung, coordination, and it rolled over every German state that year. 7 centuries of hard-won autonomy were extinguished in a season, not because Hamburg handed them over, but because the machinery of a police state took them. In 1937, the Nazi regime redrew the map itself. The Greater Hamburg Act annexed the surrounding cities, Altona, Wandsbek, and Harburg, into a single vast municipality, the Hamburg of today. In its physical outline, is partly a creation of that law. The persecution moved with horrifying speed. Political opponents disappeared into improvised camps, and by 1938, a full concentration camp, Neuengamme, was operating on Hamburg's southeastern edge, where tens of thousands of prisoners from across Europe would eventually be worked toward death in the brickworks and factories. The city's Jewish community, some 20,000 people, the community that had produced Albert Ballin and the bankers, scientists, and merchants of the Golden Age, was stripped of rights, property, and livelihood step by legal step. In November 1938, the synagogues burned while fire brigades protected the neighboring buildings. Those who could emigrate did, many departing through the very harbor their ancestors had built into a gateway of refuge. Beginning in 1941, most of those who remained were deported east to ghettos and killing sites, and only a small number ever returned. And the harbor itself, the engine of 1,000 years of exchange, was conscripted. Blohm and Voss became one of the Reich's great submarine builders. Oil refineries and armament plants spread along the Elbe. By 1940, Hamburg was not a trading city that happened to be in a war. It was, by any military definition, one of the most important war production centers in Germany, and every planner in Britain's Royal Air Force knew it. The men in London had maps of the city, the same city the emigrant millions had passed through. On those maps, Hamburg was no longer a gateway. It was a target. And in the last week of July, 1943, on nights the planners had named after a city God destroyed in the book of Genesis, the target's turn came. Chapter 10. Operation Gomorrah. 10 days in July. Before we enter this chapter, one thing needs to be said plainly. What follows is the story of one of the deadliest weeks in the history of aerial warfare. It happened to a city full of civilians, and it was carried out by the air forces of Britain and the United States in a war against a regime that had itself unleashed terror bombing on Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and Coventry, and was running death camps as these bombs fell. This chapter is not going to tell you what moral conclusion to reach. It is going to tell you, as carefully as the sources allow, what happened. The judging is yours to do. In the summer of 1943, British Bomber Command under Air Marshal Arthur Harris received approval for a concentrated series of raids against Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city, its greatest port, and one of its most important centers of submarine and war production. The plan called for round-the-clock attack, the Royal Air Force by night, the American 8th Air Force by day, hammering the same city until its industry, its infrastructure, and, in the language of the directives, the moral of its population, broke. The operation was given a code name from the book of Genesis, the city that God destroyed with fire from the sky, Gomorrah. The first blow fell in the darkness just after midnight on July the 24th into the 25th. Nearly 800 British bombers crossed the coast, and with them came a new weapon, though it weighed almost nothing. It was called window, bundles of thin aluminum foil strips, cut to precisely the wavelength of German radar, shoved out of the aircraft by the ton. On German screens, the sky over northern Germany dissolved into a blizzard of thousands of phantom bombers. The radar-guided guns fired blind. The night fighters chased ghosts. The defense of Hamburg, one of the most heavily protected cities in the Reich, was effectively switched off by tinfoil. The bombers lost only a handful of aircraft, and Hamburg had its first night of devastation. American daylight raids on the 25th and 26th followed, targeting the shipyards and the harbor through the smoke. Then came the night of July the 27th into the 28th. The conditions were a trap set by coincidence. Hamburg was in the middle of a heat wave. with temperatures that day around 30 degrees Celsius, and the air abnormally dry. The city's firefighters were still fighting fires in the west from the first raid, and the water mains there were broken. That night, the British target markers went down over the densely packed working-class districts east of the centre. Hammerbrook, Borgfelde, Hamm, Rothenburg's Ort. Neighbourhoods of 5- and 6-story apartment blocks. More than 700 bombers followed in less than an hour, dropping a calculated mixture, high explosive bombs to blow open roofs and windows and crater the streets, and hundreds of thousands of incendiaries to set the exposed interiors alight. Thousands of individual fires ignited across a few square kilometers in minutes. And then the fires did something that turned a raid into a phenomenon of nature. They merged. A single fire on that scale begins to behave like a furnace. Superheated air rises in a column kilometers high, and fresh air rushes in along the ground to replace it, feeding the flames, which rise hotter, which pull harder. Within about half an hour of the first bombs, the eastern districts of Hamburg were no longer experiencing many fires. They were inside one fire. What developed that night became one of the most destructive urban firestorms of the entire war. A self-feeding blaze with hurricane-force winds at street level tearing toward its own center. The Hamburg Fire Department's own analysis and survivor accounts collected afterward describe winds strong enough to knock adults off their feet and drag them along the pavement. Trees snapped or uprooted, and temperatures in the core estimated at around 800 degrees Celsius. Survivors described streets that seemed to burn beneath their feet, and glass and metal softening in the heat. The storm did not spread outward so much as inhale everything within its boundary. For the people in the cellars beneath those districts, the shelters that were supposed to save them became the danger. The firestorm pulled the oxygen out of basements and replaced it with carbon monoxide and superheated air. Most of the dead of that night, post-war investigations concluded, did not burn. They suffocated where they sat. Families together in the dark. Those who ran had to cross burning streets against hurricane winds, carrying sparks and embers. The survivor accounts collected after the war and preserved in the city's histories return again and again to the same images. People wrapping themselves in soaked blankets to run for the canals. People standing for hours in the water among floating debris while the districts around them burned. People who reached the parks at dawn and could no longer recognize the streets where they had lived. By morning, an area of several square kilometers had ceased to exist as a human habitat. The raids were not over. Another major British attack came on the night of July the 29th, and a final one on August the 2nd broke apart in a thunderstorm. But the firestorm night was the wound. In roughly 10 days, Operation Gomorrah had destroyed or gutted a large share of the city's housing, and the most commonly cited figures, drawn from German police and city reports compiled in the months afterward, put the dead at around 34,000 people, with some estimates running to 40,000 or more. The true number will never be known precisely, because in the firestorm zone, entire families vanished without anyone left to report them missing. The overwhelming majority of the dead were civilians, residents of the bombed districts, among them large numbers of women, children, and older people, while many military-age men were away at the fronts. Roughly 1 million people fled Hamburg in the days that followed. An exodus of refugees streaming into the German countryside with burned clothes and handcarts. Carrying news no censor could stop. The Nazi leadership was genuinely shaken. Armaments Minister Albert Speer told Hitler, by his own post-war account, that a handful of further attacks on that scale could bring German war production to a halt. Historians treat Speer's memoirs with caution, since he was a man who curated his own legend. But the alarm in Berlin in August 1943 is well documented. Yet the collapse did not come. No other raid that year reproduced the freak conditions of the firestorm. Hamburg itself, and this is one of the most sobering facts in this entire story, partially recovered within months. Forced laborers and prisoners from the Neuengamme concentration camp were put to work clearing corpses and rubble. The shipyards resumed submarine production. The war ground on for almost 2 more years, and Allied bombing of German cities continued and intensified. So what did Gomorrah mean? Lay the perspectives side by side, because they do not resolve into one easy sentence. From the Allied operational view of 1943, Hamburg was a legitimate and vital military target. A city building the submarines that were strangling Atlantic convoys, attacked with the only method then capable of striking deep into Germany at scale. In a total war, Germany had started. From the ground view, the method in practice meant the deliberate burning of residential districts and the death by fire and suffocation of tens of thousands of civilians, most of whom had little or no meaningful control over the decisions that had brought the war to their homes, and among whom lived both convinced Nazis and their victims, side by side in the same shelters. After the war, the ethics of area bombing became one of the longest-running debates in military history, and it has never closed. Serious people, including veterans of the campaign itself, have landed on every side of it. What we can say is this. In the last week of July 1943, Hamburg became one of the places where the modern world learned what industrial air war actually does when everything aligns. The city that had burned in 1842 and rebuilt in stone learned that stone does not matter when the fire comes from above and arrives by the 1,000-ton. In the middle of the burned zone today stands the blackened tower of St. Nicholas, the church rebuilt after the first great fire. Once the tallest structure on earth, the bombs of 1943 gutted it, and the city chose never to rebuild it, leaving the spire standing over a crypt that is now a museum of the firestorm. 1 tower, 2 infernos, 101 years apart. If you visit Hamburg and stand beneath it, you will understand this chapter better than any script can manage. And yet, if this story has taught you anything, you already know that a destroyed Hamburg is a Hamburg about to begin again. In May 1945, British soldiers drove into a city of rubble and refugees, and the survivors came up out of the cellars into a place the war had emptied of almost everything except the one asset no bomb had ever managed to kill: the river and the sea beyond it. Chapter 11. Year Zero and the Beatles. On the 3rd of May, 1945, Hamburg surrendered to the British Army without a fight. After everything you have just heard, the city had nothing left to fight with and nothing left to fight for. Hitler was dead in Berlin. The commandant handed Hamburg over intact in its ruins. And soldiers of a nation Hamburg had traded with for 7 centuries rolled past the wreckage of the Ulster arcades. Of all the occupying powers the city could have drawn, it had received the one it knew best. Hamburgers had always, half-jokingly, called their city the most British town on the continent. Now the joke was official policy. The city the British inherited was a landscape from a nightmare. Roughly half of Hamburg's housing was destroyed or uninhabitable, and in the firestorm districts the figure was close to total. The harbour was a graveyard of sunken ships and collapsed cranes. The population, swollen and shrunken at once by refugees and losses, was living in cellars, bunkers, and huts built from debris, and the first winters of peace were, for many, hungrier than the war. The winter of 1946–47 was one of the coldest of the century. Rations in the British zone fell at times towards starvation levels, and people burned furniture and stole coal from moving trains to stay alive. The word Germans later used for this time translates as the rubble years. In Hamburg, the rubble was measured in tens of millions of cubic meters. Clearing it took nearly everyone: municipal labor crews, former soldiers, prisoners, hired workers, and thousands of women. The figures later remembered across Germany as the true Emmerfrauen, the rubble women, passing bricks down human chains and chipping them clean for reuse. Later, memory would place the women at the center of the story, and historians have since noted that the image grew into something of a founding myth, simplifying a vast and organized effort. But the mountain of debris was real, and so was the work, and brick by cleaned brick, a city came back out of it. And here the old Hamburg reflects, the one you have watched operate since the Viking raids, switched on one more time. Trade did not wait for permission. The black market bloomed around the main station, where cigarettes became a currency more trusted than the Reichsmark. The British, whose own economy was broken, needed the port of Hamburg working, because their occupation zone could only be fed through it. So cranes were raised, wrecks were cut apart, and the harbour that had loaded submarines in 1944 was unloading grain ships by 1946. 2 events in 1948 and 49 turned survival into recovery. The currency reform of June 1948 replaced the worthless Reichsmark with the Deutsche Mark, and shop windows filled overnight, as goods hoarded for barter suddenly had a reason to be sold. And the Marshall Plan, American credit and goods flowing into Western Europe, arrived with particular meaning in Hamburg, the port through which so much of it physically passed. Add the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. With Hamburg restored as a self-governing city-state, its ancient status reborn inside a democracy, and the stage was set for what Germans call the economic miracle. Through the 1950s, Hamburg rebuilt at furious speed, pragmatic and unsentimental, as always. Wide streets and modern blocks rising over the old alignments, with only selected landmarks lovingly restored. But something else was rebuilding too, something no economic plan had ordered: Hamburg's appetite for the world, and to see it we have to walk into the one district this series has been saving, the sailors' quarter of St. Pauli, and its garish main street, the Reeperbahn, named for the rope makers who once twisted ship's rope there. For 2 centuries, this had been where the port's sailors spent their pay. A strip of bars, dance halls, tattoo parlors, and establishments we will politely call adult entertainment. In the 1950s, its clubs were hungry for cheap live music, and the fashion was rock and roll, imported, like everything else, in Hamburg. Straight off the ships and airwaves from America and Britain. So the club owners did what Hamburg merchants had always done. They imported talent, and in August 1960, a booking pipeline from Liverpool delivered to the Indra Club, a small joint at the quiet end of the district. 5 young Englishmen nobody had ever heard of. They called themselves the Beatles. The Hamburg the Beatles found was not glamorous. They played for audiences of sailors, gangsters, and night people, lived at first in storerooms behind a cinema screen, and were pushed through sets that ran 4, 5, even 6 hours a night, with the club owners shouting at them to make a show of it. They played in Hamburg across 5 separate stints between 1960 and 1962, and by the counts assembled by the band's biographers, they performed on Hamburg stages for hundreds of nights and on the order of 1,000 hours or more. Writers have argued about the exact arithmetic ever since, but nobody argues about the effect. The ragged Liverpool group that arrived in 1960 left Hamburg tight, loud, fearless, and transformed. Hamburg is where they fell in with a circle of young German artists. Among them, the photographer Astrid Kircher, whose early photographs of the band helped define their image, and who is often credited, along with others in that circle, with inspiring the combed-down haircut the world would soon know. Hamburg is where they made their first commercial recordings. Backing the singer Tony Sheridan in 1961 for a German label, Sessions first released under another name before the world knew what a Beatle was. And Hamburg is where they lost their original bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, who left the band to stay in the city for love, for Astrid, and for painting, and who died there of a brain hemorrhage in April 1962. At the age of 21, John Lennon was later widely quoted saying that he was born in Liverpool but grew up in Hamburg. Whatever his exact words, every serious telling of the band's story treats these years as the forge. Think about what this moment is. In the long arc of our story, 15 years after the firestorm, the city that had been a byword for destruction was quietly serving as a finishing school for the band that would define the coming decade of Western culture. American rock and roll, carried into a German port, hammered into shape by Liverpool kids, exported back out to conquer America itself. That is not a coincidence of geography. That is Hamburg doing what it has always done, taking in what the world ships to its door, adding value, and sending it back out. The city was feeling confident again, perhaps too confident, because in February 1962, while the Beatles were between Hamburg engagements, the North Sea reminded everyone what it thinks of human confidence. A winter hurricane drove a storm surge up the Elbe in the night of February the 16th into the 17th. The dikes broke in dozens of places, and the water poured into the low-lying districts while the city slept. More than 300 people drowned, most of them in the settlement of Wilhelmsburg. Many in the flimsy post-war garden huts the housing shortage had never let them leave. Tens of thousands were trapped on rooftops in the freezing dark. Into that night stepped a city official whose name you should remember, the police senator Helmut Schmidt. Cutting through procedure with a bluntness that became legend, he commandeered army units he had no clear legal authority over, called in helicopters, including from Allied forces, and ran the rescue like a battle staff. His performance in the flood made him a national figure. 12 years later, that same Helmut Schmidt, a boy from Hamburg's working districts, became Chancellor of West Germany, carrying a reputation forged in that flood into the highest office in the land. The disaster also forced Hamburg to rebuild its dikes and flood defenses from scratch, a decision that would be tested again and again as the sea kept rising. By the early 1960s, then, Hamburg had clawed its way back to life twice over, from fire and from water. Its port was busy again. Its music was loud, and it was sending its politicians to the top of the Republic. There was just one problem, and it was invisible from the harbour cranes. The world of shipping was about to be revolutionized by a plain steel box invented by an American trucker, and any port that misjudged that box was going to die. Chapter 12. The Container Revolution and the Wall. In April 1956, a converted tanker called the Ideal X sailed from Newark, New Jersey, carrying 58 metal boxes on its deck. Almost nobody paid attention. The man behind the voyage was not a shipping magnate, but an American trucking entrepreneur from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. And his idea was almost insultingly simple. Instead of loading a ship with thousands of individual barrels, sacks, and crates, carried on the backs of dock workers, why not pack the cargo into identical steel boxes at the factory, lift the boxes on and off with cranes, and never touch the goods in between? It is worth pausing on what shipping looked like before that box, because it is the world Hamburg had been built for. A general cargo freighter could spend a week or more in port while armies of longshoremen wrestled its cargo piece by piece. And industry studies of the era found that this handling could account for a very large share of total transport costs. Ports were labor cities. Hamburg's docks employed tens of thousands of men with their own neighborhoods, pubs, union, and politics. The container did not improve that world. It abolished it. A containerized ship could be turned around in a day. The cost of moving goods across an ocean began falling toward the point where, for many products, it hardly mattered anymore where on earth a thing was made. The box made the modern global economy physically possible, and it presented every historic port on the planet with the same brutal exam question: rebuild everything, or become a museum. Hamburg had seen this exam before. Remember the hops in the beer, the cogs of the Hansa, the filtration plant built too late, the railway built just in time. The city's entire history is a study in what happens when you catch a technical shift, and what happens when you do not. This time, Hamburg moved early. In May 1968, the first full container ship to call at the port, the American Lancer, tied up at a brand new terminal at Burchard Kai. where the city had begun building dedicated container facilities while many rival ports were still debating whether the box was a fad. Cranes replaced gangs. Computers began replacing tally clerks, and over the following decades the container terminals spread across the southern harbour like a new city of steel. The transition was hard on the dock workers whose world it ended, and their numbers fell steeply even as the tonnage climbed. But the port lived, measured in cargo. Hamburg in the container age would eventually handle more than it ever had in its history. Yet the same post-war decades that saved Hamburg's port confronted it with a wound no crane could fix. Look at a map of divided Germany, and you will see Hamburg sitting barely 50 kilometers from the border of communist East Germany. The Iron Curtain did not just divide Berlin. It amputated Hamburg's hinterland. For 1,000 years, the Elbe had been the city's highway into Central Europe, draining the trade of Bohemia, Saxony, and beyond toward the North Sea. Now the river ran through hostile territory, crossed by watchtowers and minefields, and the natural customers upstream, Leipzig, Dresden, Prague, lay on the far side of the most fortified border on earth. Trade routes that had existed since the Hansa simply stopped at a fence. West German commerce tilted toward the Rhine and the booming south. And Hamburg, once the empire's window to the world, found itself in a strange position, a world port on the edge of nowhere. Facing the sea with its back against the wall, the city answered the way it always had, by finding something else to sell. And in these decades, alongside the containers, Hamburg's most influential export became words. There is a reason for that, and it is one of the more hopeful stories in this series. After 1945, the British occupation authorities, drawing on their own newspaper tradition, licensed a new press in their zone, and Hamburg became its capital. Walk through the city centre in those years, and you would pass, within a few streets of one another, the newsrooms that would shape how West Germany saw itself, the news magazine, Der Spiegel, the Mirror. Founded in 1947 by a 23-year-old journalist named Rudolf Augstein, alongside the great weekly Die Zeit, the illustrated Stern, and the mass circulation tabloid Bild. Add the broadcasters that grew up beside them, and by the 1960s, this port city was producing much of what the country read and watched. The city of merchants had become, in effect, the nation's newsroom. And in October 1962, Hamburg's newsroom collided with the state in a scandal that helped define the young democracy. Der Spiegel published an article questioning the readiness of the West German army, and the government's response was to have police occupy the magazine's Hamburg offices and arrest its editors, with Augstein himself jailed for more than 100 days on suspicion of treason. The reaction stunned the government. Students and journalists protested across the country. Rival newspapers offered the silenced magazine their own printing presses, and the defense minister was eventually forced from office. The courts declined to convict. Historians of modern Germany often point to the Spiegel affair as a coming-of-age moment, the point where German public opinion decided that the press criticizes the state and not the other way around. That lesson was learned in Hamburg, in the same stubborn spirit that had once forged a charter to spite an empire. The last decades of the Cold War settled into this rhythm, containers stacking higher, presses rolling, the city-state governing itself under mayors who moved on to national office, Helmut Schmidt above all, who became Chancellor in 1974. There were shocks, an oil crisis that gutted the shipyards in the 1970s, the long, slow shrinking of Blohm and Voss, street battles over squatted harbour houses in the 1980s, but the deep fact of Hamburg's position, the amputated hinterland, seemed permanent. Every serious forecast assumed the wall was simply the weather now, a fixed condition to be managed forever. Then, on the evening of November the 9th, 1989, the weather broke, the Berlin Wall opened, the East German state dissolved within a year, and Germany reunified in October 1990. And if you want to know what that moment meant in Hamburg, do not look at the political speeches. Look at the river. Within months, barge traffic was moving up the Elbe toward Dresden and Prague again. The old routes to Central Europe, to Poland, to the Baltic states. Routes the Hansa had pioneered 7 centuries earlier, reopened one after another like blocked arteries clearing. Hamburg woke up one morning and discovered that it was no longer a border city on the edge of the West. It was sitting, once again, in the middle of Europe. The 1990s handed the city one more gift, this time from the far side of the planet. China was industrializing, and the container trade between Asia and Europe began growing at rates the industry had never seen. Hamburg, the deep hinterland port for the recovering markets of Central and Eastern Europe, became one of Europe's main gateways for Chinese trade. The port's numbers climbed toward records year after year. 1,000 years after a wooden fort watched the river for Viking sails, the Elbe was carrying the commerce of a connected planet, and Hamburg stood where it had always stood, at the toll gate of the north, collecting its percentage, which left only one question, the question this whole series has been building toward. What does a city like this do when it finally gets what it always wanted? Peace, unity, open routes, record trade. What does Hamburg build when nobody is burning it down? Chapter 13. The Gateway Today. The answer began, fittingly, with the one part of the city that time had left behind. By the 1990s, the old inner harbour, the quays and warehouses closest to the historic centre, had fallen quiet. The container revolution had moved the real port south across the river, to terminals built on a scale no 19th century quay could match. What remained along the city's waterfront was a half-abandoned industrial zone, fenced off, largely empty. And sitting on some of the most valuable urban land in Germany, in 1997, Hamburg announced what it intended to do with it, and the plan was pure Hamburg in its scale and its self-confidence. The city would build an entirely new district on the old harbour land, block by block, over decades, housing for thousands, offices for tens of thousands, schools, parks, a university, all of it raised on elevated plinths above flood level, because this city has never once been allowed to forget what water does. They called it Hafen City, Harbour City, and it grew into one of the largest inner-city development projects in Europe. Walk through it today, and you move in a few steps from the brick gorges of the old Speicherstadt warehouses, now a World Heritage Site, into streets that did not exist when the Berlin Wall fell. And at the westernmost tip of that new district, on top of a massive 1960s cocoa and coffee warehouse standing in the river, Hamburg decided to build itself a crown, a concert hall, wrapped in a wave of curved glass rising from the old brick base, designed by the Swiss architects Herzog and de Meuron. When the project was first presented to the public, the city's share of the cost was put at around 77 million euros. It opened in January 2017. Years behind schedule, after lawsuits, a construction standstill, and a renegotiation of the entire project, at a publicly reported cost to the city of around 789 million euros, with the total project cost commonly cited at roughly 866 million. The overrun made it a national scandal and a punchline for a decade. The building is called the Elbphilharmonie. And then something happened that no budget committee predicted. Hamburg fell in love with it. And so did everyone else. The public plaza drew millions of visitors. The concerts sold out far ahead. And the silhouette, part ship, part wave, part crystal, became the city's new symbol almost overnight, printed on everything the way the old church spires once were. Stand across the water in the evening when the glass catches the light, and you can watch tourists photographing a former warehouse the way they photograph the Eiffel Tower. The most Hamburg detail of all is the location. The city put its concert hall of the 21st century not in a palace quarter, because it never had one, but on top of a warehouse, in the middle of the working river. After 1,000 years, the message had not changed. What matters here is the water, and what moves across it. But a fair portrait cannot end on a postcard, because the gateway today is fighting for its future, and nobody in Hamburg pretends otherwise. The giant container ships of this decade draw depths the tidal Elbe struggles to offer, and Hamburg lies more than 100 kilometers from the open sea, at the end of a dredged channel that must be deepened again and again, at enormous cost, and after years of court battles with environmental groups over the river's ecology. The deep-water rivals, Rotterdam and Antwerp, sit closer to the ocean and handle more containers. Hamburg remains among the largest ports in Europe as of the mid-2020s. But the race is real, and the city has answered it in a characteristically commercial and controversial way, bringing the global shipping giant MSC into HHLA, the port and logistics company through which much of Hamburg's cargo flows and in which the city kept a controlling share. Supporters called it binding cargo to the Elbe. Critics called it selling the family silver. Merchants arguing about a deal in the harbour. Some traditions never die. And beyond the ships, the sea itself is rising. Hamburg's flood defences have been raised again and again since the catastrophe of 1962, and surges higher than that deadly one have since been held back by the new dikes. But every serious climate projection points the same way, and a city built on a tidal river, whose newest district stands on plinths above the water, is not debating that future. It is engineering against it, permanently, as a condition of existence. Behind that stands the oldest question of all. What happens to a city that lives by open trade in a world that keeps threatening to close? Hamburg boomed for 30 years on globalization, and it has watched, in this decade, a pandemic snarl the world's supply chains, a war return to Europe, and great powers talk once again of rivalry and decoupling. The last time the world closed, in 1914, it broke this city for 30 years. Nobody here needs that lesson explained. It is carved into the blackened tower of St. Nicholas, which still stands over the harbour as we finish this story. Exactly as it stood over the beginning, so walk back down to the waterfront where we started. Before sunrise, with the gulls and the cranes and the container ship sliding up the river in the dark, you know now what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the fortress the Vikings burned, and the free city a forged charter built, the brewhouse of the Hansa and the neutral profiteer of Europe's wars, the last ground under the feet of 5 million emigrants. And if your family came from that half of the world, quite possibly under theirs, the city the cholera shamed, the firestorm annihilated, and the flood drowned, the stage that forged the Beatles, the newsroom that taught a democracy to argue, and the harbour that bet on a steel box and won. 1,200 years of destruction, and the place has never once stayed down. Not because Hamburg is lucky, by any fair count. It is one of the unluckiest cities in Europe. It endures because of a single stubborn idea, held through fire and water and war, that a city is not its buildings. A city is its position, its people, and its next voyage. Everything else can burn. And in Hamburg, at one time or another, everything else has. The ships are moving on the Elbe this morning. They always are. That is the entire history of Hamburg, and the whole point of it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, there are more cities waiting on this channel, and more to come.